Slavery, as an institution, is as old as history. But the uniquely American form of slavery, enslaved Africans and their descendants forced to labor for Europeans, began when the age of exploration brought Europeans to the shores of both Africa and the Americas. When Portuguese ships began exploring the coastline of Africa in the 15th century, they sought not slaves, but gold and other riches. Successful expeditions returned with wealth and with enslaved Africans. Though initially African slaves were acquired by raids along the coast, once they reached the coast, the African slaves were placed into barracoons, or holding pens, to await the European traders. They might spend weeks in these pens, growing sicker from the poor sanitation and unclean water. By the time they were ready to be loaded onto the slave ships, they were sick, hungry, dazed, and exhausted. They were thrust into the holds of ships manned by strange people who spoke a strange language. During the journey across the Atlantic, called the Middle Passage, the conditions of the slaves varied from very bad to completely horrifying. 12 million Africans would begin this journey. 1.5 million would not survive to reach their destination. Usually the men were confined in the holds at night, but allowed on deck in chains during the day. Some ship captains would forbid sexual contact between the crew and the female slaves, while others saw it as a benefit of the trade. These new slaves were generally terrified of the water, many of them never having seen the ocean and having no concept of ships. They were seasick, often refusing to eat. The ship's crews would force-feed them if necessary, in hopes of delivering slaves that were healthy enough to be sellable. Experience taught slavers the importance of improved sanitation, ventilation, and other steps to ensure they would deliver enough healthy slaves to make a healthy profit. But this long journey for African slaves did not begin with the first European expeditions along the African coast. Although some slaves were captured and sent to Europe, the wholesale acquisition of slaves did not become a significant goal of African trade until Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. Columbus discovered the island he would name San Salvador in October 1492. A year later, on his second voyage, he introduced sugar cane to the Caribbean islands. And the success of sugar planting in the islands, combined with the Europeans' recently discovered sweet tooth, would lead to the explosion of European enslavement of Africans. The Spanish would first attempt to use Native American slaves to work the sugar fields and Central American gold mines. But they were susceptible to disease, and unlike the African slaves, they had no prior farming skills. Natives could also more easily escape and disappear among their own people, which was obviously impossible for Africans. And finally, using indigenous Americans meant capturing and enslaving free men, whereas Africans could simply be purchased from their own people. The first sugar grown by African slaves in the Caribbean reached Spain in 1516. By 1570, 1,000 tons of sugar a year was produced by the island of Santo Domingo. Production quickly spread to other Spanish islands, such as Puerto Rico, and then, in the 1540s, to Brazil. By the end of the century, Brazil alone produced 16,000 tons of sugar each year on the backs of 100,000 African slaves. The Atlantic slave trade had begun in earnest. Over 3 million Africans would be shipped to work the sugarcane fields in Brazil, and millions more would be sent to the Caribbean islands. In what is known as the Triangle Trade, Slaves, sugar, and rum were traded in a profitable system, profitable for all but the African slaves. The slave trade was initially controlled by the Spanish and Portuguese, who in the early 16th century dominated the seas. The first African slaves in North America were in Spanish colonies in the early 1500s. The San Miguel Guadalupe colony was formed in the area that would become the Carolinas. That colony experienced a revolt in 1526, in which there was a struggle over leadership. The slaves took the opportunity to revolt as well, and they escaped to live with the local natives. The colony was then abandoned. The Spanish San Agustin colony in Florida, founded in 1565, was the first permanent European settlement in North America. This settlement also had African slaves. As Spanish and Portuguese power waned, the Dutch and then the British became the primary slave trading nations. By the time Britain had entered the slave trade, over 600,000 Africans had already been shipped across the Atlantic to the New World. It was Dutch traders who brought the first Africans to the British colonies in North America. In 1619, Dutch traders brought about 20 Africans to Jamestown in the colony of Virginia. These Africans likely served as indentured servants, as would other Africans brought to North American British colonies in the early 17th century. But slavery grew slowly in North America. Unlike the British Caribbean, where British colonies put tens of thousands of African slaves to work on sugar plantations, the North American colonies did not immediately require the manpower that slavery could provide. That changed with the growth of the tobacco industry in the Chesapeake region of Virginia in the 1620s and 1630s, though it did not truly take off until the 1660s. At first, the tobacco plantations were worked by both slaves and indentured whites. Indentured servitude, which had existed in Old England as well, began as a process in which a young man would apprentice himself to a skilled craftsman. In return, the apprentice would provide his labor for a set number of years, for being taught a trade and provided financial support. As tobacco plantations required more and more labor, indentured servitude became a means of strictly providing a labor force, rather than the old apprenticeships. In those years, African and European indentured servants might work side by side. Africans could purchase their freedom through work, just as Europeans. Like slaves, servants could be sold, transferring the years remaining on their term of service to the new owner. This practice made it easier for Virginia's planters to soon accept the buying and selling of African slaves. Nonetheless, Africans working as indentured servants enjoyed considerably more freedoms than the African slaves who would soon replace them. But this situation would not last. An early sign of the changes to come occurred in 1641,